There we go. We're recording officially. And yeah, so throughout the session, we're just going to have their three speakers talk, and then towards the end will be a Q&A session. So, you know, feel free to pop any questions that you have into the chat box throughout the presentations. And then at the end, we'll come back and address them, and I can direct them to our speakers. Or if you prefer, you can use the raise your hand function, and you can put your hand up virtually, and it'll draw my attention to you, and I'll be able to ask you to give a question to one of our speakers. Yeah, so just really briefly about connecting communities with peatlands and this webinar series. So I spoke a little bit more about this at the very first webinar. I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but Connecting Communities with Peatlands is a project that's funded by the National Just Transition Fund, and it's led by Irish Rural Link and the Community Wetlands Forum. My name is Aoife. I am the project coordinator for Connecting Communities with Peatlands. And really kind of as part of the project itself, we did an assessment last year with community groups across the Midlands on what they would like in terms of training going forward through the project. And, you know, having some kind of knowledge base around peatlands, something really basic and accessible for them, was one of the main things that came up over and over again. So that's what brought us then to this webinar series, to build your bog knowledge. And, you know, we've been looking at, I suppose, the formation of the bogs, the biodiversity, the species of plants and animals in relation to culture. And obviously, and I think probably one of the most important things would be climate change and bogs, and their really, really significant role that they play. And then finally next week, looking at how community groups and individuals are already engaging with peatlands in their communities, and how they're going about it. So that's next week's one if you want to sign up. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Elena, I'm after forgetting how to pronounce your last name properly already, even though I said it maybe 2 or 3 times before the beginning. Elena Aitova? Yeah, okay, she says I got it good. I didn't do too bad. So Elena's a PhD student, and she's working in Peatlands Restoration at NUIG Galway, and is currently measuring the greenhouse gas emissions on Cloncrow bog in Tyrrellspass in County Westmeath. And her presentation will look at how peatlands help us to combat climate change, and why Irish peatlands are as good as rainforests, and maybe even better. So Elena, if you want to share your screen and take it away.
Hi everyone, thanks Aoife. Just one sec, I'll share the screen again. Can you hear and can you see me? Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Aoife. That was great. You pronounced my surname perfectly. And as Aoife said, yes, peatlands play a big role in climate change, and that's where come my name for my presentation, that peatlands are climate change heroes. So my name is Elena Aitova, and I'm a PhD student at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And today I will tell you why peatlands are so great to cope with climate change and why they're Irish heroes. So 2 years ago, I had no idea what peatlands are, and now I get fascinated by peatlands more and more every day. So what are peatlands? Probably you already got the idea on the previous webinars, and I just will run fast over it. So everything natural on Earth, plants, animals, people, are made in part of carbon. As we die and decompose, the carbon is released back into the atmosphere in the form of CO2. But peatlands are naturally waterlogged. It means that no oxygen can access under the water. This means that as the plants die and sink in a bog, the carbon that normally is released into the atmosphere is kept below the water. This makes peatlands amazing natural carbon storage. Peatlands were collecting carbon for thousands of years. Actually, peatlands were collecting so much carbon that they were causing small ice ages. So our newest estimate is that Irish peatlands store 2,216 millions of ton of carbon at the moment. And what we don't want is that this carbon would be released in our atmosphere. But what is about the trees? Aren't they aren't they carbon storage too? Yes, they are, but not always. To be quite honest, I always thought that planting forest is the best way to cope with climate change and save the planet from global warming. But later I learned that forest is good only in an appropriate climate and on an appropriate soil. It happens that in many parts of Ireland, climate is too wet for forests to grow, and trees in such places would not grow healthy. The Wicklow Mountains is a great example of it. The natural environment there is mainly giant peatlands, and the conifer trees, Sitka spruce, that planted there actually damage soil, and they also destroy biodiversity. As you can see on this slide, trees on mineral soil actually pull in CO2 from the atmosphere, but they don't do it if they grow on peat soil. The other thing is that peatlands store more carbon than forest. Peatlands are a very unique ecosystem. They cover only 3% of our planet, but they store twice as much carbon as all global forests cover. And in Ireland, peatlands cover around 20% of Irish total land area. So let's to compare. A hectare of tall rainforest has the same amount of carbon as a hectare of just 30 centimeters deep peatland. But imagine that in Irish Midlands, peatlands have been found more than 7 meters deep. For example, in Cloncrow bog where I work, we measured the depth of peatlands, and it was 8 meters. It means that if we do rough calculation, that Irish peatlands could contain around 24 times more carbon than a rainforest. I think it's amazing. Unfortunately, many peatlands were drained and used for agriculture, grassland, turf, cutting, or planting forestry. So if there is no water, oxygen can enter the soil, connect with carbon, and turn this carbon into CO2. So when peatlands are dry, they start to give back all the carbon they were collecting for thousands of years back to our atmosphere. Here's an old map of Cloncrow bog, and green line shows the extent of the bog in 1800s. And here's what's left of it now. The green line shows the original scale, and the blue lines show the areas that haven't been cut or drained. As you could see, peat soils were converted to other land uses, mainly grassland or turf cutting. But this soil continues to emit carbon. According to our latest research, grassland on peat soil, not on mineral soil, but grassland on peat soils releases around 1.6 million tons of carbon per year. So it is important what we do with our peatlands. And our next other speaker, Caroline, she will talk more about the initiatives available to manage grassland on peat soil. So there is a solution for it. So in my project, I measure how much carbon is released back to our atmosphere by Irish drained peatlands. Then I compare it with how much carbon Irish peatlands could avoid losing if they were to re-wet, and even maybe actively capture from the atmosphere and lock it again in the soil. As Aoife mentioned, I work in Cloncrow bog in County Westmeath, where I measure greenhouse gases from the same vegetation in dry conditions, in dry area, and in the area which has been re-wetted last year. What I want to know is the difference. How much carbon is released to the atmosphere from dry peatlands, and how much carbon we can save and even take back from the atmosphere from the re-wetted area. So I do the measurements with different lights as plants photosynthesis depends on it. And I also try to do my measurements few days a month, and I'm trying to catch different weather conditions as well. So on the graph here, you can see example from 1 day of measurements, and you could notice that emissions from the dry part, which is red, is higher than for the wet part, which is green. It's not height there, it's the light there. So it's different type of light. So it's the strong light, so you can see that it's lower, so it means the emissions are lower, and then light is bit less light, it's shaded, so the peatlands slightly higher emissions, and then when it's dark, there is no photosynthesis, so peatlands plants emit CO2. So according to existing research, this is going to improve in the next 2 years as well, because Cloncrow bog was re-wetted last year and it was disturbed. So we're waiting for conditions and plants to stabilize. So one of the big arguments against re-wetting is that re-wetting stops CO2 emissions, but increases methane emissions. So now research was done, and it was proven by few research teams that after a short peak directly after wetting, methane emissions are significantly decreasing. And also it's good to know that methane has a short lifespan, but CO2 is kept concentrated in the atmosphere for a long time, and it was caused climate change and global warming. So it is CO2 that is a bad guy in the story, not methane. So now we learned that peatlands are great to deal with global warming, I hope, but at the same time, there's still huge areas covered with water that are not great use to humans, or are they? Peatlands are not only great at storing carbon, they're best flooding defense. They're like a sponge. They take all rain in first, and then they release it slowly. And you will be very lucky to have peatlands close to your town, because they're great natural filters for water. All the pollution is left behind in the peat, and water gets nice and clean to rivers and lakes. This is the case when we have healthy peatlands, not the dry ones. Also, peatlands being so wild and remote that they contain many rare plants which have not been discovered yet, and it might help to find new treatments against diseases. I know that a team in Trinity College is working on it at the moment. Who knows, maybe we can find a medicine against COVID in Irish bogs. Also, don't forget peatlands are the great place for hike too. Hope we will all be able to enjoy a new boardwalk in Cloncrow bog, thanks to local community group Ethos in Tyrrellspass and Eugene, who is attending here today. And here's the most important slide of my presentation today. Here is the local group Ethos in Tyrrellspass, who is to be part of our research project. Last autumn, we did sphagnum moss transfer with them and the local secondary school students. The students will be back this spring to monitor the progress. Last week, I was in a conference and I was listening to Hans Schouten. He's from Wetlands International, and he put local communities at the heart of the peatlands restoration. As scientists, we're here to show the community what asset you have in the form of peatlands, and in which way this asset could benefit people and the local environment. It is the local people who own the place and who are to benefit from it. So for peatlands to bring their benefits back to people, they need to be rewetted. They need to be wet. In Cloncrow bog, where I work, National Park and Wildlife Service, together with Bord Namona, restored area by building peat dams, and they use new techniques as well, called they build bunds or earth barriers to keep the water in the bog. But more about wetting techniques and restoration we will know from our next speaker. Thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elena. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, I think you're dead right. Communities are at the heart of peatland restoration for sure. Yeah, so thank you so much. I think that was really, really comprehensive and really easy to kind of wrap our minds around what bogs can do in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, what they can do for our environments and for our communities. So thank you so much. So our next speaker is Paddy Crushell. Paddy is an ecologist and director of Wetland Surveys Ireland. And I'm really looking forward to Paddy's presentation on bog restoration. So Paddy, if you want to take it away there.
Okay, so you should hear me. You can just see the shared screen there, can you?
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Aoife and Elena. Yeah, so I'm leading on just to speak about bog restoration or rejuvenation as it's being promoted here this evening. I say it's a similar term, I guess. Just to, I'm really just going to talk about the need to restore the bogs. Now, there'll be a bit of duplication with Elena's talk, but not a lot. And I'll concentrate more on the methods and the progress made towards bog restoration in Ireland and what needs to happen into the future. So that site there, I suppose that's what we're trying to recreate. This is probably our most intact raised bog in the country. It's unusual in that it's down in that lovely county of Kerry. But most of the raised bogs will be up in County Offaly. So you can see here the margin of the bog hasn't been disturbed. The surface of the bog is very much as it originally was. It's never been drained. And that's mainly because there isn't an outlet. There was no opportunity for anyone to ever drain it. So it's just by good fortune that it's remained as it is. It's formed inside in what one calls a kettle hole, a geographic formation. So that's what we're trying to or what one would try to recreate, I guess, if they're trying to restore the bogs in the Midlands or in the west of Ireland that have been disturbed. Degraded. So just this is a similar map, I suppose, the original map from Hammond 1979 and the extent of peatland in Ireland. It's very much corresponds with Elena's one earlier where she showed the extent of blanket bog and raised bog. Raised bog is obviously very deep peats in the Midlands, are the red areas here. The blue-green are all more blanket bog in the west of Ireland where you get the shallower peats. But I suppose just to put it in context, the extent of raised bog originally estimated to be about 311,000 hectares, raised and blanket bog together over 1 million hectares. Of that 1 million hectares, I think it's estimated as 24% or 269,000 hectares of that peatland still remaining. Now that's in varying degree of degradation. It's basically where the peat surface remains, but it may well be very dry at the surface and emitting carbon, such as Elena was explaining. Or it could be near pristine peatlands, of which we've very few, but there are areas out there. So I suppose it's less than 24%. And I suppose that's mainly represents the western bogs, the raised bogs, really it's a much lower percentage. So this is just a raised bog resource in the Midlands. Most of it's in the Midlands, where the original extent, as I mentioned a minute ago, is 311,000, 310,000. And this is the extent of intact high bog. So that's just over 10% of it remains, which means that the bog hasn't been cut away down to the minerals ground layer. So it's only about 10% of it remaining intact. But of that, only about 1,500 hectares remains in an active peat forming condition, which means that it's wet enough to sustain sphagnum mosses and to accumulate peat over time, as Elena mentioned earlier, the process involved in that. But so that's less than 0.5, or it's about 0.5% of the original raised bog resource is in that good condition. And it's really only when it's in that condition that it's providing all those ecosystem services that Elena was mentioning. And that's where we need to expand we need to get a lot of this stuff here that's over in these categories back over into this category here. So that's the ambition. Again, this is a bit more of what Elena was speaking about, the provision of ecosystem services by an intact peatland. You've got your biodiversity, supporting habitats and species, climate regulation, that's where the carbon storage and sequestration or accumulation, water regulation, again, water purification and flood attenuation, and landscape recreation. Cultural heritage preservation, I think, is a key one as well that maybe goes unrecognized sometimes, where we're looking at the historic landscapes that are preserved beneath these bogs. These bogs are cut away, well then that's lost forever. Cultural, yeah, and then peat as a resource obviously is another ecosystem service that's provided. But that landscape in that photograph there is our western peatlands. It's taken out near Ballycroy in County Mayo, and that's what that landscape would look like, or it continues to be very intact and natural. So I suppose that's what we're hoping to achieve in that scenario. How to undertake bog restoration? I suppose, as I mentioned, the aim of it is to re-wet the bog surface. We want the bog surface to be wet enough to create conditions suitable for sphagnum moss. So you can see in the photo down here in the bottom right that bright green and red colors that's dominant across the surface is the sphagnum bog. You can see standing water in places, but that's again is what we're trying to create, I suppose, or recreate those kind of conditions. Obviously the biodiversity that comes along with that. You've got these wetland or bog indicators. I suppose the bogs are, it's not necessarily the diversity of species there, but it's just these unusual species that can't occur anywhere else. So they're very much dependent on the bog to survive. So once the bogs are gone, they've no refuge to return to. So where to start? I think this is a good question. I suppose you're trying to get those conditions we just spoke about here. If you're starting in a situation like on the bottom left here, where it's an industrially cut over and you're probably down to the very base of the peat, I think it'd be very, very difficult and very, very long time span before you could ever expect carbon to be accumulating at that site again. Not so much at the effort in putting in the restoration, but just the natural progression to go from that to a peat farming ecosystem will take many generations and probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. The next situation over, I think you'd have success in a much shorter period. This is where you've still got the intact surface of the bog. I mentioned 50,000 hectares of the raised bogs are still intact. So if you're looking for maximum gain in the short term or kind of in human time scale, you'd be best probably to concentrate your efforts on these sites where the drains are in there, but the surface of the bog remains. As well, the techniques involved in trying to re-wet this site is a whole lot easier than perhaps on the bottom left, where you've got much more land use in the surroundings affecting the water table. Whereas on the high bog, it's very much almost like an isolated system in itself, that once you get the water table up on the surface, it should hold it. You're not dependent on what's going around in the mineral lands as such, not usually. So I suppose and then on the right there, you can see, I mean, there are the other challenges you're going to have is where you're going to prioritize your efforts. That's the edge of the raised bog, where there's peat cutting there. That's me standing on top of that at some stage, about 15 years ago. But you can see there, like Elena mentioned, there's probably 6 meters of peat there just exposed. So you've got the choice to maybe work on the cutover, try and get some establishment of pioneer bog communities, or you've got you could again move up to the high bog where I'm standing there and try and concentrate your efforts there. But this also shows the challenge you have, that if you've got that big drop in elevation, you're also going to have the water leaking out of the bog towards that situation for as long as it's there. I suppose the other thing is to why you should work on the high bog is that even though there's in the intact or the most pristine examples are on the high bog, they're still degrading due to drainage around the edges or drainage through the middle of the bog. So while there's active raised bog still there, it's not likely to survive long without some kind of intervention or re-wetting or drain blocking going on. So I think that's the other reason why you should concentrate on the high bog, is to start with halting the loss of active raised bog and also trying to expand it. And then I suppose the priority sites to start working on, I suppose the logic is that you should concentrate on those sites that are of the highest importance, which are those recognized especially as conservation or natural heritage areas. So this has been the logic in the national program for bog restoration, and these are the sites that have been targeted first, I guess, or most effort has been put into. The methods to restore the bogs in Ireland. A lot of it is, there's a lot of work going on before you ever get out on site, and that's the restoration planning. So I suppose if you've got your individual site, this is just an example of an individual raised bog down here in the photograph in the bottom left of the aerial photograph. First thing you want to set your objectives, like what is it we can restore here, and what is it we want to achieve. And to do that, you want to assess your ecology, but also your hydrology. The hydrology is the key parameter here, because it's the ecology will follow if you got the hydrology right. So if you get the water table up to the surface, the ecology will just come back after that. So it is the key thing, is to try and get the hydrology right and restore that water table right at the surface. I think the definition of it is, or where you get the best peat forming communities, is where you've got a fluctuation of no more than 10 centimeters in your water table throughout the year. So for no period of the year should be 10 centimeters below the surface. So that's the sweet spot that you're trying to recreate throughout as much of the site as possible. So that's you have to assess the current hydrology, but also the ecology of the site. Where is your active raised bog at the moment? Where's the degraded stuff? And then look at the hydrology and see where the water table is being affected most, and try and target those areas. So you plan your restoration measures based on these. I suppose what you're doing here is you're doing a hydrological restoration plan. On the left-hand side, the green area there is actually active raised bog. So that's where conditions are very good right now, and you've got your actively forming peat. The blue area, however, is those areas which, according to the hydrology, the slopes and everything, if the water table was raised, it could support raised bog communities, or it could support active raised bog. So that's the blue area there. So this map, and that's known as what's defined as degraded raised bog, and that's all to do with the slope and the hydrological conditions there. So they're the areas that currently they're not active raised bog, but the physical conditions are such that it could support active raised bog if there was some drain blocking or something like that done to keep the water at the surface. It's kind of implying that you're wasting your time in these areas that aren't shaded at all up in the north, for example. I wouldn't say you're wasting I suppose it's just where you're targeting first more so than anything else. But you, even no matter what you do up there in the northern part of the site, you wouldn't expect that area to re-establish peat farming communities in any short term into the future. So that map there on the left informs what you're going to do on your site, and that's shown on the map on the right. Basically, it's the yellow dotted lines there showing where you should be doing your drain blocking to try and achieve what you want to achieve. And as I mentioned, it's not only about getting the blue stuff back to active, but it's also keeping the green. So that's why we are still blocking drains up on the northern part of the site. And also there's potential for expansion, possibly in the Cutover, which are the lighter colored areas just around the dark peat. So that's the approach that's been taken throughout our designated sites over the last 10 years. Most of these restoration plans for all of our SACs and NHAs are now prepared. And it's a matter of getting the resources together and getting the work done on the ground. But that involves an awful lot of engagement with communities, stakeholders, landowners, and everyone else, plus the costs. And that's something I'll speak about in a minute. So this is, I suppose, what's been happening in the last 10 years in the Irish context. National Peatland Strategy was published in 2015, which set out where we want to see things going with regards to peatland, what we should be doing with the resource. Then there's a National Raised Bog Conservation Management Plan, which set targets for certain bogs, and it involved that process I just mentioned a minute ago for SACs. And an outcome of that was you got a restoration plan for pretty much all sites in the country. And there's been, I suppose, one of the deliverables or the plan, one of the ways of delivering the plan is this EU LIFE project, the Living Bog project, which is ongoing over the last 5 or 6 years. It's just, I suppose they've come to the end of their funding, but they worked on 12 sites in the Midlands to block drains and try and restore the hydrology. So they made great headway. I think they've achieved 95% of their objectives originally. And those sites, Cloncrow isn't there. I'm just looking at the list. I think I'm not sure which project, it's Care-Peat, I think, and some of the projects are doing Cloncrow work. But sites on this are Clara, Furban, Mongan, these are all sites that would be well known. So the actual standard methods, I suppose, I'm kind of concentrating on what's been happening on the high bog, and I think that's because we feel that's the low-hanging fruit. That's where you can get the maximum gain for the resources you're putting into it. There is if anyone wants a more technical background to this, it's published in the very simple, very well laid out best practice in raised bog restoration in Ireland. But just the main thing is you're using peat is what creates the dams. So the idea is you've got your drain on the bog, you use an excavator, you dig out a keyhole on either side of the drain, and then you take peat from adjacent to the drain and you use that to create your little peat dam within the drain. And that's done every 10 centimeters drop in the drain level along its length. So you get a massive, you get an awful lot of dams along one length of drain. But that's done on quite a few sites now at this stage. That's the profile there at the bottom. You can see the height of the dam. That's quite important that it's about 0.5 of a meter above the surface of the drain, because otherwise the water can get around the edges and stuff. So all these techniques were developed over, I suppose, the last 20 years. I suppose the main thing was there was a Dutch-Irish project back in the 90s that would have developed a lot of these methods that I'm explaining. Just to give you an idea what it looks like on the ground, there's a couple of peat dams. That's the length of drain. That's the drain blocking has been undertaken. You can see the water is backing up either side of it. Very different to the drain I showed you a while ago. And you can see the water ponding either side of the drain. So that's creating conditions suitable that we're trying to recreate throughout the site. Just on the right-hand side is, I'm not sure which site this is, but it's an example of what these look like from an aerial photograph just after drain blocking has been done. These little black marks on the aerial photograph are your burrow pits. So that's where you're taking the peat and using it to build the dam. They can sustain nice dragonfly communities and stuff because you're creating a little pond in essence. And that'll eventually fill in with sphagnum as well. But you're using that peat to put the little dams in place, which you can see in the photograph there as well. That's an example over in Ballydangan Bog in Roscommon. Again, an aerial shot, and you can see all the yellow and all that color there is the sphagnum moving out of the drains. And you can see this on the right-hand side, you can see a lot more dams along the length of drain, and that's because the slope was probably greater. So there was a need to put in more dams. Whereas in the center of the photo, there's probably not a great drop in slope, so there wasn't a need for many dams in these areas. And you can see the sphagnum is already there, it's expanding out from the drains. But as you go off in the distance, you can see those little black dots at the dams. That's Clara Bog. Those peat dams these drains here that are shown on the surface, they were blocked in the mid-90s. So that's almost 30 years ago. Yeah, almost 30 years ago. So it'll like those marks will forever be there. The site was pre-drained in the mid-80s by Bord na Móna before the restoration works were done in the 90s. So, you know, even though it's 30 years later, you still, you know, I think they'll forever be visible on the surface of the bog, but it is working. The bog has got a lot wetter, and it would be a very different situation now if that peat restoration wasn't done in the 90s. This is Clara as well. It's a different technique. It's kind of cell bunding. I think that's the kind of work that's been done up in Cloncrow. I'm not that familiar with Cloncrow. I haven't really been up there. But you've got these bunds. It's near the edge of the bog where you got a drop in slope. So this is how they're thinking they might be able to handle the drop in elevation of face banks and that. So it's just another technique. The important thing is you're controlling the water table. You can see there's little orange pipes there going through the dams, and that means that if it gets up to a certain level, there is an outlet to let it go through. If you don't have that, the fear is that pressure will build up and it might just burst through the dam. Other methods, you got plastic dams, partial blocking, cell bunding, I just mentioned that. Marginal bunds on the bottom photo there, you can see there's this is what you can do in cutover areas, I guess. Put a low bund or a little dam along the edge of the cutover, and depending on the levels, you could get build-up of water on the upside. And again, that's probably done maybe over the last 15 or 20 years, and there's very good sphagnum regeneration there in the cutover. So as I say, we've been concentrating on the high bog, so it's great now that people are starting to move on to the cutover. I think Caroline's going to be leading on to that in a minute, out from the cutover into the farmland, which is the next step. The other thing, sphagnum inoculation, I see there, they've been trialing that up at Cloncrow as well, so that's another technique. Just some examples. The National Parks and Wildlife, I suppose I think they've done restoration works on upwards of 40 bogs at this stage. But you can see the areas of A or B getting back if things go well. It's still very low. It's 9 hectares, 5 hectares, 5 hectares. So we have a long way to go to try and rehabilitate the 65,000 hectares that's in the climate action plan. Other bog restoration projects, I've mentioned a few. There's Gurley Bog, Lodge Bog, and these are IPCC and the Dutch Foundation for Conservation of Bogs. They also did they did a number of site purchases as well, would have secured a number of bogs. Abbey Bog obviously is a great example of a community project. Quilty EU Life projects, they've been successful doing a number of projects taking conifers off the high bog and trying to restore the hydrology there by blocking drains. So they did some blanket bog sites in the 2000s and raised bogs in the last 15 years maybe. Bord na Móna, obviously there's an awful lot of investment now with Bord na Móna going towards rewetting and rehabilitation of their bogs. Again, they've started on the sites where the high bog is intact on the basis that you're going to get the best bang for your buck. That's it. I'll hand over to Caroline. I think Caroline's going to be kind of extending out from the high bog out to the adjacent mineral lands and the challenge that presents. But I think the challenges there are much greater than the high bog. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paddy. That was really, really interesting. I absolutely loved the aerial view photos because I've seen the dams obviously walking around the bogs and, you know, they look so fascinating, but from an aerial point of view, I don't think we realize how many are put in throughout the bog. It's kind of mind-blowing.
I'm not great at the figures, but on Clara East there in the mid-90s, like the local ranger there, Colin Malone, put in an awful lot by hand with a few spades, a couple of guys over a few winters, and it's just hundreds of kilometers of drains, so it's phenomenal.
A huge amount of work, but it looks amazing, and you know, it's kind of incredible that you say that, you know, that could be visible then for hundreds of years, you know, and, you know, we look at it, I suppose last week we talked about the archaeology side of things, and we were the people finding trackways, and maybe a couple of hundred years from now, people will be saying, well, this is the mark that we left. So yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Paddy. And we're going to go on to our last speaker, last but not least, Caroline. So Caroline and I suppose, kind of work together in some sense. Yeah, so Caroline is project manager of the FarmPEAT project that I'm sure some of you may have heard of already. And she's an ecologist as well. And she began her career with the Irish Peatlands Conservation Council as well. So Caroline is going to talk about the work of the FarmPEAT project and what they're doing with farmers, and that it's also linked to peatland restoration. So she's going to give an overview of the results-based approach and the work that they've completed so far. So Caroline, please take it away.
Thanks, Aoife. Thanks very much. God, I was totally entranced with those two talks. They were brilliant. Thanks, Elena and Paddy, for setting the scene. So yeah, I'm going to try and I suppose expand out a little bit into the agricultural land surrounding the high bog, while still talking about rejuvenating and rewetting, restoring, and all that. So as Aoife said, my name is Caroline Lalor, and I'm project manager of an EIP project. It's a 2-year project called the FarmPEAT project, Farm Payments for Ecology and Agricultural Transition. So I suppose I'll be focusing a lot on the FarmPEAT project as well, and the approach we're taking with farmers in trying to restore the peat soils. Is that moving on, Aoife? It is. That's okay. Yeah, okay, perfect. So I suppose this has been covered beautifully by the other speakers, so I won't dwell on it too much, but I suppose this is a photo of a damaged peatland, which we would associate and be quite familiar with in the Midlands of Ireland. It's been commercially harvested. And this would be another type of damaged peatland, again, looking towards the edge of a high bog. And this photograph on the lower end is the damaged peatlands that we're working with in an agricultural setting. So I suppose sometimes, you know, we don't realise that this could have been part of the high bog at one point. And if it wasn't part of the main high bog, it would have been part of the transitional zone. This is a farm in the FarmPEAT project, and it is located adjacent to a high bog. But the peat soils here are very deep. Very rich in carbon. They've been drained, obviously reseeded and fertilized, and it's managed now for agricultural production, but it's you know, it is essentially part of originally what would have been a bog. So it is a damaged peatland, and we know, and Elena had some other figures as well relating to the emissions from raised bogs, and we know that this is from research done by the EPA, or at least figures compiled by the EPA and TAGISC as well. They say that 1 hectare of intensive agricultural grassland on deep peat can emit somewhere in the region of 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So that would be like greenhouse gases equivalent to 20 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's per hectare per year. So it's quite a lot of emissions, and it is somewhere in the region of being equivalent to running 4 average cars for a year. So if you had 4 cars, you know, just your average car, that the emissions that come from running them for a year, you would be kind of talking about the emissions coming from 1 hectare of agricultural grass. And so that's, I suppose, where we're coming from, and why we feel it's so important to try and I suppose change the management practices on these deep peats and try and reduce those emissions. I should have said at the start as well, we're a 2-year project, as I said, but we're funded by the Department of Agriculture. So the Department of Agriculture has targets to re-wet agricultural grasslands on peat for this reason as well, to contribute to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland. And I suppose our job is to just investigate the possible solutions to that and the possible ways forward. So we're working with farmers, as I said. We have 36 farmers in the pilot project, and we're increasing that this year to about 50. And the farmers are at the heart of it. They're the owners of the land that we're working with. They're managing the land, and it's we're kind of working as a team with them. And I suppose our job is to support them, to give them information and support then if they want to undertake actions to move towards restoring or rewetting or rejuvenating, that we can kind of support them in that. in that way. We have an operational group, which, because we're in partnership with some other groups. Paddy Crushell is the director of Wetland Surveys Ireland, so he's one of our partners as well. And then the Irish Rural Link, Ummer's Community Development, and we have a steering group as well, which gives us a lot of technical advice and guidance. So that's kind of how we're set up. The main aims of the project, I'll just go through these quite briefly. So we've kind of two main aims. The first one is to work with farmers to design a results-based agri-environmental scheme for the Irish Midland landscape. So we're based in the Midlands, we're focusing on raised bogs, and as I said, we're focusing on the area around that, on agricultural, under agricultural use. And we want to design a scheme that will incentivize improved management. So it's more about incentivizing and supporting rather than kind of saying, no, you can't do that. So basically anything if a farmer signs up for a program, it's all voluntary. If a farmer wants to undertake an action, they can, and we will support them. And if they don't want to, that's absolutely up to them. It's their land to do with as they wish. And I suppose our main aim, as I said, is to try and benefit climate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but not forgetting, of course, the other ecosystem services and benefits that we recognise from peatlands, being biodiversity, water quality, water regulation, and all the other ecosystem services as well. And so also we want to reward farmers for maintaining and improving the local environment. And I really think this is a beautiful thing about the results-based approach. So I'll talk about the results-based approach in a minute, but one of the beautiful things about it is that if a landowner has been managing their land over the years in a way that now this land is producing benefits for the environment, there is a reward for them straight away in our program, a financial benefit, you know. So it's not just rewarding someone who has done damage and rewarding them to improve it. And then the second aim, which is also really, really important, is increasing awareness of the importance, so not only of the raised bog, which we've been talking about, but also the sustainable use of these agricultural peat soils that I've been talking about. So the importance of, you know, the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming off them, and the importance of managing them in a more sustainable way to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll talk about that as well a little bit later. So as I said, we're based in the Midlands. Elena, we're up with you as well. We have some farmers up in Cloncrow bog, and that's in Westmeath. We've two bogs over here in South Roscommon, Clonbowley and Ballynamona, and then we have 4 sites completely in Offaly, Ferban, Clara, Raheenmore and Dangan, and then we have 1 site here on the Kildare-Offaly border, Ummer's Bog. And I suppose, as Paddy was mentioning, some of these sites already, so a lot of these are protected sites. They're protected for their active raised bog habitat and other habitats as well, and species. So we're working with them, and I suppose one of the reasons that we picked these sites originally was that there has been some restoration work completed on the high bog in many of these sites. So by moving out to the surrounding area, we feel it's a kind of a good support. Like we mentioned already, the hydrology, and the hydrology is key on the high bog. And so if you can imagine, the high bog is like a cake, and you're coming out to the edges, and if the edges where it's now, we'll say agricultural, under agricultural use, if the water table suddenly drops down there, that's going to actually impact the high bog. So if we can get our farmers to manage the hydrology on those peat soils that's adjacent to the high bog, and kind of support the hydrology on the high bog, it'll go a good way to supporting the restoration work and the conservation objectives of the high bog as well. So that's just to give you a flavour of where we are. We have an interactive map on our website as well, if anyone wants to go and look at these sites in more detail. Again, I think a lot of this has been covered already, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but you know, peatlands, they're just so important from many perspectives. They're kind of getting their moment of glory now because we're in a climate crisis, and they can do so much for us in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But when I started working with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council about 20 years ago, it really, there wasn't much recognition in the wider public that they were important from a climate perspective. And I remember reading a paper by Florence Renault Wilson, who Elena mentioned as well, and you know, that was the area that she was researching and promoting, the use of peatlands, or rather the restoration of peatlands, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's lovely it's lovely in one way that now they're gaining that recognition. Obviously, it's unfortunate that we've come this far in terms of damaging them, but it's also really, really important not to forget the other important things about peatlands, and we've mentioned them already tonight, so I won't go into them again, but the biodiversity, the physical benefits, the spiritual as well, and mental health benefits, I think, that we could gain just from being in these wonderful wilderness places. And there we go, some nice pictures of what they can look like. So this is one of our sites in Offaly, Dangan Bog. And I suppose, again, it's an aerial photograph, so we're looking down from on top, and we can see our brown area in the middle is our raised bog. And here is the land around it, which looks, I suppose, if you were looking at it, you would think that's mineral soil, okay? But I'm just going to turn on a layer now, which will show you where the peat soils are in this area. So you can see this shaded light brown area is actually peat soil, or at least it's indicating to us that it's most likely peat soils. And so it shows you, I suppose, the original extent, or the likely original extent of the raised bog in this area. And so we know that by looking at this map that these agricultural fields here and all along here and all over here as well, and the forestry as well, they're all on peat soils. And so if they look like this and they're on peat, they've been drained, the peat is dry and it's emitting carbon. So these are the areas we want to work with, and we want to hopefully get these farmers on board on the FarmPEAT project. Okay, so the results-based approach, I mentioned this. So basically, we are designing a results-based agri-environmental scheme for our farmers to sign up to and work with. And so if you think of a traditional or original agri-environmental schemes in Ireland, the ones we're more familiar with, like REPS or GLOS, these are action-based. And so farmers that sign up to the kind of original REP style action-based agri-environmental schemes, they get paid per action. So they undertake an action, and then once the action is completed, they're due a payment. And there's no real follow-up or monitoring of the actual results. So the intention was that there would be an improvement in some aspect of the environment, but there would have been no follow-up on that. So 10 farmers could undertake the same action. You could get 10 widely different results for the environment, and they'd all get paid the same. So the new sort of movement now is towards this results-based approach, and I suppose it's more fairer on the farmers undertaking the actions or owning the land and managing it, and it's also more effective, we feel, as well for the environment. So basically, we look at the result on the ground, and the more benefit that the land is giving to the environment, and there can be different targets. So in our scheme, our main target is reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon. So the more benefit that there is for that, then the higher the payment that would be due to the farmer, no matter what the action was. So it's very specific, and it's very farm specific. So just to, I suppose, explain a little as to how it works. So if you're going to, the way it works is we go onto a farm and we go into every field, we call them plots, okay? So we go into every plot and we score every plot. And the score is related to the targets that we're trying to achieve. So our target, as I said, is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also biodiversity and water quality. And so the higher the score that a plot receives means to us that, okay, that plot is producing well for the environment in terms of biodiversity, water quality, and carbon reduction or greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so that plot will get a high score. If it gets a low score, then it gets little or no payment. And so it's quite fair then if a farmer is managing the land for benefits to nature, they get a high payment. If they're managing it more for agriculture and there's not much benefits to the environment, you kind of assume they're getting a payment through their agricultural produce, and we wouldn't feel necessary to pay them for the environmental benefits. So that's kind of a simplified way of just describing how we do it. We have scorecards, so obviously when we go into a plot, the first thing we have to decide is what kind of habitat are we working in. Some of our farms actually do own a little bit of the bog itself, like a bit on the high bog. So if we're up there, we would use a peatland scorecard. If we're in a habitat that's more grassy, we'll use a grassland scorecard. And then we'll also score other semi-natural habitats like woodlands, tree lines, hedgerows, etc., because they're all producing environmental benefits as well. And I suppose, so yeah, we have those the paper scorecards, I should say, and they're available on our website if anyone wants to look at them. But when we're actually in the field doing the scoring, we have an app. And so I suppose just to kind of give you an idea, like if we're in a grassland area on peat, we will use a wet grassland scorecard. And the idea is, like, the closer that that field is to an actual intact or, you know, natural wet meadow or wet grassland, the higher the score that plot will receive. And so a natural intact wet meadow would be very rich, you know, in biodiversity. It would have a lot of wetland plants. The water would be quite high. So again, in our peat, the water is key. Florence Renaud Wilson refers to the water as being the blood of the bog. So you want lots of water in your peat soils. And then also there'd be no, you know, major damaging activities or, you know, quarrying or anything like that going on. So if you have a plot like that, it's going to get a really high score and the highest payment that we have in our scheme. If you have a grassland plot on peat and it's all ryegrass or clover, you know, it's producing for agriculture and it's not producing for the environment, so it gets a low score. So basically the scorecard is a series of questions. It's designed to be quite user friendly and just with a little bit of training that almost anyone could use it. And you come up with a score out of 10 for your plot, 10 being the highest, 0 being the lowest. So just to give you kind of an example, some of the plots from our project, from the farms on our project, a low quality, low scoring plot will get a low payment. Moderate kind of one, you can see the rushes there indicating that the peat there is wet at least sometimes throughout the year, gets a moderate score, a moderate payment. And then this is more biodiversity rich and wetter as well. Over here it's quite wet, so it's getting a high score and a higher payment. And then I suppose so that's called the results-based payment, so the payment that's based on the result. And then we have this supporting actions payment, and this is really important because we feel like for the farmers that are here, or even here, for them to get here, it would take a lot of money and effort and time as well. And so we have a fund to support them to undertake actions which will improve things on their farm to get to somewhere like this. So just to give you a bit of an idea in terms of payments to farmers, we're kind of in line with a lot of the other agri-environmental schemes that are out there. So our average payment to farms in our scheme is about €2,000, maximum 8,000, minimum 300, you know, more or less. That was based on last year. And obviously, you know, the difference there being, I suppose, could be the area of land that you have that's a peaty land, and then the condition of it as well. So it's based on the condition, the quality, but also the area. And this is what we're paying for. So we're paying for peaty soils where the water is high, the peat is wet, there's lots of sphagnum, there's lots of heathers in your peatland plots. If you're in a grassland plot, there's lots of your typical grassland species, indicating wet peat. And then in these plots where the plots themselves are scoring low, the payments are coming from the field boundaries, because we felt that the tree lines and hedgerows are there, especially on the mineral parts of the farm. So we include the whole farm. So if there's mineral land and they have tree lines and hedgerows, they get a benefit and a payment for those as well. The big question for us, as I said, we're a 2-year project. And for us and our farmers is like, what about the next 10 years? And it's a big challenge for us and for the farmers that, you know, we're asking them to make major changes on their land for the benefit of society and the benefit of climate. But we, you know, in our project, we can only guarantee them a payment for 2 years, and we don't know yet what's really coming after us for the farmers. And obviously from reducing greenhouse gas emissions on peat soils, it has to be long term to get the benefit. In terms of supporting actions that we would hope our farmers to be undertaking for the benefit of the environment, it would be going back to, I suppose, some of the things Paddy was showing us earlier, would be blocking the drains, slowing the flow of water on these peaty plots. So like, I suppose in the agricultural setting, on the high bog, you're aiming for your water table to be up within that 10 centimetres of the top of the bog surface. On our agricultural plots, you know, we're working with farmers who are working the land. So any bit of an increase in the water table in those peaty plots is going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from those peaty plots. So we are not saying to the farmers that they have to, you know, bring it up to the top. If they're willing to bring it up 20 centimetres and the water level is still quite low below the surface, that's fine. We're happy to do that, support them to do that. And then, you know, maybe bit by bit, they'd be happy to bring it up higher. But these are some of the actions that we would hope they would be undertaking. So it would be slowing the flow of the water in the peaty plots, maybe providing alternative feeding and drinking facilities in some of the plots if they're accessing drains for, you know, stock or accessing drains and stuff like that. So it's a mix of greenhouse gas emissions, water quality and biodiversity sort of measures. And this is an illustration just to show, I suppose, ideally what we're aiming for. So this is the landscape in the Midlands before FarmPEAT, and then after the FarmPEAT actions have been undertaken, we're hoping to get somewhere like this. So here you can see all the water is draining out of the bog into the river. You know, if it's draining that quickly, it's probably bringing a lot of sediment and nutrients as well from the farmland here. What else? The cattle here are accessing the river, and there's a ring feeder here very close to the river, no buffer zone, turf being cut here, and maybe too many sheep on this plot. And then down here, it's the drains have been blocked, the water is being flowing much more slowly. There's a nice buffer zone here, and the water quality in the river will be better. There'll be much less greenhouse gas emissions associated with these peaty areas, and hopefully even maybe some carbon sequestration here. Obviously that's a big ask in 2 years, but we'll dream and we'll aim high anyway. And then a big part, as I said at the start of our project, is education and community outreach, and that is really, really important. Again, I think it's been mentioned already by the previous two speakers, but the community is so important in terms of protecting a bog, and there have been many examples from communities around Ireland where it was the community who actually stopped the major degradation of a bog and managed to turn it around and become a big asset for the community. So it's something to be really, really proud of. If you have a raised bog in your community that hasn't been completely harvested, it's something to be very, very proud of. In Europe, you know, we have some of the best remaining raised bogs in Europe, and Paddy mentioned, I think we've somewhere around 1,600 hectares of active raised bog left in Ireland, and it's a tiny percentage of what we once had, but compared to the Netherlands, and I think they actually had a lot more than us originally, but they have something like 18 hectares of active raised bog left, you know, and they've spent millions of euros trying to get there. So for us, it's so important to protect what we have, not only for us, for our communities and for the climate, but I mean, it's, you know, if we don't, some generation will have to try and do it, and it's going to cost them a lot more. So, and the benefits, we've mentioned them as well. So the benefits are huge. So we're working with schools and local communities as part of the FarmPEAT project. My colleague, Paddy Malone, he's our community liaison officer, and he's come up with this Love Your Wellies outreach initiative. And it's been a huge success so far. We've engaged with about 1,000 schools, and we've had this Love Your Wellies arts competition with primary and secondary schools. We've had them out in the bog. We've had workshops and talks in school, Zoom talks. We've done an awful lot with them, and they have produced such amazing artwork and videos and models and everything. So we're going through the judging process at the moment, and follow us on social media. There should be some nice artistic submissions being displayed, and we're going to have a public vote as well, so you're all more than welcome to be voting. And then this year, so that was kind of launched last year and it's running into this year, and this year we really want to get more engaged with the local communities and the community groups around the raised bogs. Paddy has already been linking up with Ethos in Tyrrellspass, and I know Eugene is here tonight, and Elena, I'm sure you're working with them as well, and also community groups in Clara and in Lullymore. So we're really looking for more community groups around the Midlands to engage with. So if anyone here wants to, please do get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you. So that's the FarmPEAT Love Your Wellies that I mentioned, and we have a YouTube channel, we have Twitter and Facebook and a website, and there's loads more resources there. And yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we're happy to take questions now, I think.
Thanks so much, Caroline. You know, like I started working in and around the same time as Caroline when she started the FarmPEAT project, and myself on this project, and it's just, you know, it's so important to have communities, farmers, people who are part of driving change, who are taking ownership of it, who feel that they're connected to it. And like I really do hope that, you know, you get to see some fantastic results this year, and you get to see the dedication from the farmers, and because I know you are working really hard, and yeah, you are doing a fantastic job. So thank you so much for sharing that with us and letting us know how you're getting on. Yeah, so I think we'll get into some of the questions. The chat box has been going the entire time, so it's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for putting in your questions. So I'm going to go actually back up to the start. And as I said at the beginning, I don't know if some people might have missed it. You know, if you want to use the raise your hand function to ask a question directly, you can, of course. So please do that. Okay, so we have a question here. Yes, so there's a lot of discussion about opening boglands that need protection for recreational uses. So the question is, how much sense does it really make to open those sensitive environments from the conservation point of view? If anyone wants to take that out of our speakers, if we want to make a comment.
I presume by opening up, they mean like providing access into the sensitive areas, is it?
Yes, yeah, for recreation, I suppose, like either through boardwalks or walkways, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a tricky one, and I'll pass on to Paddy probably after this and Elena, but it's probably a tricky one for a lot of habitats, and in particular peatlands, because they're very sensitive to trampling and disturbance. But on the flip side, you want people to experience them, and then if people can gain an experience of peatlands and gain more appreciation, they're more likely to appreciate them for what they are and want to protect them. So you do see a lot of boardwalks going in on peatlands to provide that sort of access that is more sensitive to the habitat and it's not causing damage. And I could be wrong here, but even at that, I think most of the boardwalks might be kind of more on the fringes and not bringing people right into the centre where there might be more sensitive habitats. Paddy, correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with Caroline. I suppose, look, I feel kind of strongly that in the appropriate areas, I think it's a good idea to open them up and have them accessible to people to experience. But I think it's the right measure in the right place. Like I don't hear many people complaining about the boardwalk at Clara, and it's just amazing to see the amount of people out there now and how much the management of that area has improved so much since people have accessed it and the appreciation of it from when I was there 20 years ago, and all you'd see there is a bit of rubbish thrown around the car park. But again, there's a limit, I guess. You know, there's some places the boardwalk isn't appropriate. And it's also got to do with where the visitors are. What's the point? I've seen boardwalks put in places and they haven't been walked in 5 years. And that just isn't poor planning, I guess, really.
Yeah, that's it. You know, I suppose any of the projects or groups that I've been speaking with, a lot of them are put on along the edges and to avoid those habitats in the middle and to protect those in the centre. And then as well, you know, just in terms of people, I suppose, accessing these kinds of spaces, the leave no trace principles as well are something fantastic to follow, and you know, to implement when you're out and when you're walking and when you are out on the bog or in any kind of space in general, so that you're doing less harm to the environment as well. And we've got a couple of hands raised, so I'm going to take a person who has their hand raised and then go back then into the chat box, so we're getting a little bit of alternation between the questions. So Jamie, you had your hand up first, if you want to go ahead.
Hiya, thanks Aoife. Hi everyone, great talks again. These sessions have been absolutely wonderful. I've learned so much. Just in relation, Paddy, into your figures there for the beginning, I just wanted to, I guess, get an opinion from you. I've been interrogating the figures around bogs for a while now. And so we add up the raised bogs as 300 odd, we have the blankets at 700, and then you have 96,000 hectares of fen, which is just 1.1 million of peatland. Yet the figures you present add up to 1.4, whatever. So I found there's about 300,000 hectares of peatland unaccounted for in the national parks or in the national peatland strategy. And I've asked a number of people about this. So I'm just wondering, you know, can you figure out what's going on with those figures, and can you offer some advice? Is there some sort of crossover there between agriculture, land, forestry? Where is the 300,000 1,000 hectares missing. What are they? Do you know?
Well, you're saying there's 1.4 million mentioned somewhere. Is that
in your figures? Well, if you add them all up.
You're talking about the individual ones where it's farmed peatland and industrial cutaway
Yes.
and rehabilitated cutaway.
Yeah, it adds up to one. So it's crossover somewhere, but I can't work out where that crossover is.
Yeah.
I know it's an awkward one. If anyone else has any comment on it, I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
it's the bogs generally trying to work out what, you know, as your own work says in County Monaghan, there is bogs or there's peatland there that is not accounted for. So there is, I guess, still mystery around the true extent of peatlands in Ireland.
I think still that the go-to resource from what I've read is very much, although John Connolly might have a different opinion, he'd probably be the person, the authority on it really these days, but I think that peatland map of Ireland is still deemed to be probably the most useful, accurate assessment of it. Well, I don't know, as you say, there could well be some double counting going on. I showed the two types, like that figure near a million, 1.1 million is generally what I would have thought. And I think I didn't throw fens in there, but again, there's so much uncertainty surrounding that. I thought I'd just leave it out. But yeah,
it's a very tricky question about area, and it's John Connolly is working on it in Trinity, and I had the same difficulties working on trying to calculate how much emissions Irish bogs emit in total, because if you don't know the area, how can you calculate tons of carbon from peatlands? So even in one of land use category, the numbers could be different from different sources by 100,000 hectares. It's a massive estimation to make. So I think this is the area where it's way more research needed, and this is underway at the moment, and hopefully we'll get better numbers, better figures soon.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to do a question in the chat box and then I'll come back to you guys. I can see there with your hands up. One of the questions here is from Kathy in relation to the situation with private peat extraction companies, such as horticulture peat producers. And is there anyone working with them, or how will their situation as privately owned land banks be approached in terms of the cessation of extraction and restoration? That's a big question, I think, is particularly at the moment, but I don't know if anyone wants to comment on it or take a part of that. I think all of us could probably come in on that.
I wouldn't have much to say on it or no, but I think it's one of the difficulties of them being outside of the planning system all along, is that there isn't any requirement for rehabilitation or reinstatement, whereas there would have been if they had gone through planning and the appropriate planning process, I imagine. So it's very, very tricky. I wouldn't hazard to guess how it would be managed, because again, it's kind of the polluter pays principle as well. It would kind of go against that if all of a sudden you're funding the restoration of these areas.
So they could potentially just not come online? Potentially, like that, you know, that nothing might change in those areas of bog. Am I right?
I've no idea.
Yeah, no one knows. Yeah,
there's potential, I suppose, in terms of the policy outlook at the moment. There's a significant lack of regulation in relation to the private sector, so there would need to be, I suppose, a political want for this level of regulation. And you know, I think right now in our current political climate regarding it, it's a very touchy subject, it's very tentative. And then also, given that we have very, very few alternatives to for horticultural peat, something that's quite viable and inexpensive, it's going to be very difficult until we have a good alternative as well. So yeah, it is. It's going to take a lot longer, I feel, anyway. Just from my limited knowledge of that area.
You need to have a webinar with policy people who would understand the regulation and legislation behind it.
I imagine that like these people are generally business minded and profit driven, so I think there could well be potential there for carbon credits and stuff into the future, whereby there's potential there. But you know, morally, I'd have a slight issue with that. It's sold the peat and they're benefiting again from carbon markers, but that's just me.
Yeah, thanks a million. I kind of thought that was probably the answer, but I just wanted to ask people who know more about it than I do. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kathy. Aisling, you have your hand up there if you want to ask a question.
Hi, yeah. Just want to say it's all of the talks have been really great, so thank you. I'm sorry, I kind of have a point for each speaker, so I'm really sorry. But it's really great and interesting. So first of all, I just wanted to say, if I could add on to Elena's talk, especially in terms of it's good to see the numbers and things, because I know, if I remember correctly, it's when you're looking at, say, people always countered the argument for restoration with methane versus CO2, but if I remember my numbers correctly, 1 CO2 is equivalent to 25 methanes, and the fact that bogs are so good at taking up carbon that they take in more than they're releasing and then some. That's why bogs are so important, and it's quite interesting to see that you've still got negative uptake in your rewetted or in your rewetted cells. So that was quite interesting to see on your results, Elena. So that was quite interesting. So yeah, and so moving on, sorry. For Paddy, I had a question in terms of, particularly in terms of restoring the places where they're down to the bottom 30-40 centimeters as such. Is turning them into fens kind of been ruled out as an option, because fens are still peat producing but somewhat different in nature?
Is there anyone in particular that wants to take that?
I'll say the one that Aisling, I think what you asked me, the sound wasn't great, but I think it was whether areas of water where the water table is a bit too low to reinstate, that you'd maybe have a target for fen rather than raised bog. Is that the thought?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
Much better, yeah.
Sorry,
I
think, headphones.
Yeah. I think what would drive your where fen is an appropriate one would be, it all depends on what's left behind after whatever drainage or peat extraction works have been done. If you're down to where there's a groundwater influence, fen is obviously going to be your target. So certainly in a lot of those more cutaway areas, such as the Bordnamona picture I showed, or the industrially harvested area, I think the natural target there would be fen, but it very much to do with the chemistry of the water in the area that you're trying to restore. And generally on the high bog, it would always be peat or bog peat or bog rather than fen.
Yeah. How else do you also get around the sort of erosion complexes at the edge of high bogs? Is it basically shuttering it and yeah?
I think it's to be determined. I think, like I said, the low-hanging fruit was the real high bog. I think it's just going to be a matter. I think the general thinking, like if you could think of the natural shape of a high bog, would be like a droplet of water, and it goes down very gradually towards the edge. And if you could think of that, where you've got the abrupt edge like that, the water table is more rounded beneath that surface. So I think you're just going to have to live with the fact that there's dry peat near the edge of the bog, and that's going to just eventually oxidize and go away. So it's just a small loss that you might have in those areas, I imagine.
That's great.
I'd only wonder then, would you just have a perpetual problem of erosion complexes?
Oh yeah. I think it's probably more of a problem up in the blanket bogs. You're getting the erosion on the slopes and stuff. You wouldn't come across it too much on the raised bogs or the edges of them.
That's good, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisling.
And also, I had one for Caroline as well. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah, we're great.
Sorry, I noticed with the FarmPEAT that it seems East Galway's sort of been, it's kind of missed the catch as such, but I know there's a lot of, say, boundary farms to the Bordnamona areas and things like that. I know the FarmPEAT project's only for 2 years, but would they be potential areas for the next, if there is a next scheme, would they be potential areas for looking at?
Yeah, I think so. So we're being a pilot project, I suppose. We had to draw our boundaries, somewhere, draw the line somewhere and limit our, I suppose, our target to match our resources and that. So obviously the bogs we've selected are not all of the bogs that to which our approach would apply. And so there are plenty of other bogs where there's agricultural land surrounding those bogs with peat soils where the exact same would apply. So I assume that when the department does roll out something, assuming they're going to roll out something for farmers, that they will be focusing on a wider range of bogs. I think their intention is to initially focus on designated raised bogs, NHAs or SACs, and so possibly that will include some of the ones in East Galway that you're mentioning.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. David, I know you've had a question in the chat box, but you also have your hand raised, so go ahead. Sorry, you're on mute, David.
Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, the question in the chat, I think, has been answered there. It was about other people in the farm project, but that's fine now. You needn't go through that again. I was just wanted to mention about the boardwalks in the bog down by me, Cloncrow bog in North County Roscommon. They had one there, and it wasn't used much. I used to go out and a few other people, but they had a car park that you couldn't use because it was flooded most of the time because it wasn't raised up enough. So a lot of people couldn't stop there because there's no parking. You know, there's a small roadway. If you park there, you're blocking up the whole road. But the other thing is, it got rotted over the last few years, and they went in and took it all out last year. And I think they did more damage using the heavy machinery going in, taking it out, than they would have had of any of the people going in for the amount of people that were in it. So I just thought that was raised now. I just found that as an issue that, you know, taking it out with heavy machinery could have done more damage than the amount of people that would have been using it. I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if they're going to put the raised bog back in. At the moment, it's said it's temporarily closed. But for me, I found it fascinating to be able to stand out in the middle. They had a platform where you could kind of sit there and look around and be surrounded by this bog on, you know, almost all sides, and just be fascinated there. So if you had talks or anything, you could actually go out there and be in the middle of the bogs. So it could be a good thing to promote it and educate people that way. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, thanks, David. Like, that's true, because like there's so many different peatlands where they have built the boardwalks, and then you have the nice platform out in the middle. Like I was recently down on Scorecards bog in Tipperary near Clough-Jordan, and just at the end of the boardwalk you come out onto this viewing platform, and you have, like, you can see for miles around, and like it just makes it so much more accessible. You can appreciate it more. We were doing a training day that day as well, so like there's those benefits again, like that we were talking about earlier on in relation to having access and things like that to the bog. So it's great, and yeah, thanks for raising that. And just for everyone here that is here, David wrote a blog piece for our Bogs in Transition blog, so that's also on our website with some absolutely stunning black and white photographs of his local bog. So if you want to check that out, you can go over onto our website. So thank you so much, David, for that. Jamie, I think you're the last person with a question. I don't see any more in the chat, so if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, just again, just to put Paddy in the spot again there. So I just want to say something. He had an image of Sheeharee at the beginning there. I think it's Sheeharee, and I discovered Sheeharee having read around Foss and O'Connell's entry into the the European Myers book, and I looked up these bogs, and Sheeharee, we got a debate going on Twitter about it, a discussion when I discovered it, and just brought it to a lot of people's attention. And two comments on it, as well, a comment first of all, and an idea, and then a question for Paddy. First comment is, we have this idea, this discourse from Florence Renner Wilson in the Bogland 2011 report that says there are no raised bogs, no intact raised bogs left in Ireland. And the presence of Sheeharee actually existing at all it dispels that notion there's no intact raised bogs, because Sheeharee is basically pristine and there's no evidence of any cutting. So is that something that maybe people could discuss? And second of all, maybe Paddy could comment on why Sheeharee has never been cut. You know, what is the reason? I might do some work on this myself at some point when I finish up my own current project. But I'm just interested in, is there any, again, we had a debate around this, was there any superstition attached to it, or is there any reason why that bog is basically pristine and the only example of a pristine raised bog, if that's what it is in the state? Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose, look, I'd also have written, I suppose, that there's no intact raised bog in Ireland. I'd still kind of stand over it. I think Sheeharee, while it's largely intact, it's near pristine, it's not quite there. There is a drain maybe at one end of it. I think to answer your question about why it's remained intact, I'd love to, I'm from Kerry, by the way, I'd love to say it's the environmental morals of the Kerry people, but I don't think that would wash. Or environmental conscience. No, I think, I don't know. My guess is that it's just in such topography that there is not a way of getting an outlet unless you have to pump it dry, and it would have to be continuously pumped dry because it's just a very deep depression within a little landscape. It's and as well, I suppose, to say it's a raised bog is, yeah, some people would argue that it isn't, that it's, if you go out there, the vegetation growing on it is actually more transitional between bog and fen. But I'd agree, it's a raised bog. It's not that very much raised above the landscape, but I think the dominant thing is that the water is rainwater primarily. But the most impressive thing about the whole thing is that you've got that intact zone between the mineral soil and the bog, which is absolutely extinct everywhere else in Ireland, from what I'm aware of, the natural transition, and that is remaining there at Sheeharee. So yeah, they're kind of my thoughts on it. Yeah, I don't know anything about the superstition side of things. I know it was up for sale last year. I don't know whoever bought it or if anyone ever did.
I mean, you know, we hear about Clara an awful lot, and we hear about, you know, Rahim Moore. We have the forest, you know, All Saints. You know, we've all these amazing landmark peatlands, of course, Pollarstown Fen and Scragbog, of course, is an intermediate. But Sheeharee is something that gets the attention, I think, and I think it'd be great if it did get the attention that I think it right, and you, as you indicate, the lag that it deserves as one of the best peatlands in the state, top 5 anyway.
Thanks so much, Jamie, and thanks, Paddy, for answering that. There are just 2 questions left in the chat, and I think we'll answer those and then call it a night. I try to wrap up around 9 o'clock so that everyone can go off and go to bed early, like me, at 9:30, because I've nothing else better to do. So there's a question here on why do we need peat? Why do we need horticultural peat? I don't know if any of our contributors want to take that, if they have any experience, I suppose, in that regard.
It's a funny one, because peat in its natural form is very nutrient poor. I suppose we've been talking about how peat forms, and it's acidic and it's waterlogged, and so the nutrients are largely gone from any nutrients that would have been there, and all the plant species that are unique to bogs have adapted to this really low nutrient environment. So why peat moss is so valued as a horticultural agent, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure myself. And the thing I find very frustrating about it is that, and Paddy, I'm sure you're the same, like because Paddy worked in the IPCC before me, I might say, so like for 20 odd years, you know, people have been saying peat free, you know, we have to go peat free in our gardens and we have to go peat free in our horticultural industry, and it hasn't been happening. And so now it should be happening, and yet the industry isn't prepared. I'm not blaming anyone in the horticultural industry, but I'm just saying, you know, it's been going on for so long. So why there aren't any alternatives developed, and sustainable ones? It would be wonderful if they were here now. I'm sure there's other, I don't know an awful lot about it, to be honest, but I'm sure there are options there, and I'm sure people are researching it, and maybe there's something there. But yeah.
Kate Flood is the great person to answer this question. I thought that peat is used in horticulture because you can add whatever you want to it to create the type of soil for different plants, whatever you need. So it's like white paper, and you can create the type of soil you need for growing some type of plants. That's my understanding, at least.
I also think, isn't it also because it's relatively sterile, as in because it's such an acidic system, nothing else can grow in it until once you've taken it out, and then once it's dry, there's no seed bank in it, so it's pretty sterile for growing things in as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. My partner is a horticulturist, so we have this conversation very regularly, and he's recently done research on what is kind of, I suppose, the best kind of grower, and yeah, horticultural peat won in that experiment. But anyway, that's the arguments that we have in our spare time. But yeah, like it's true. It's based on that it is sterile. There's less bacteria, and you want to have less bacteria, I suppose, when you're growing, whether it be food or garden plants. In relation to that. Okay, so I'm just going to take one more question, and that'll be it. So the question here is there any possibility of shifting to crops more suited to waterlogged conditions within the FarmPEAT project, if there are any? She said she's heard of the term polludiculture. Am I saying that correctly?
Yep.
Passed around, but I'm uninformed of its role here in Ireland. So Caroline, that's definitely one for you.
Yeah, I might join you there, being uninformed in its role in Ireland as well. But yeah, polludiculture is basically the, what would you say, cultivation of wetland plants for as a crop. And it is being done on the continent, so in the Netherlands and in Germany, maybe some other countries as well. And actually at the Care-Peat conference last week, there were some people there speaking about some polludicultural projects and stuff that are going on there. So I'm sure all those talks will be available online at some point. It's not really happening here to my knowledge. Yet maybe, and so some of the things that are being grown on the continent would be, typha. It's a bulrush. It's a big kind of quite a strong looking plant with the kind of cigar like thing on top. You might not see it in canals and the edges of lakes and things, and that's grown, and it is being used to, as instead of those styrofoam packaging that you might get at a takeaway food, for example. They can make sustainable products like that from it, or insulating material as well. I don't know, I don't know how widely available these products are on the continent. Are they just kind of projects level, or are they more widely available? I don't know yet, but it is being something that's being looked into. And actually, going back to the horticultural side of things, there are projects looking at the sustainable harvesting of sphagnum, so kind of actively growing sphagnum with the intention of harvesting some of it for the horticultural industry. In Ireland, I don't think it's happening yet. Paddy, maybe you might know something. You can correct me if I'm wrong. In the FarmPEAT project, it's not really something we're looking into. I suppose the short answer is no. But again, in a 2-year project, we're just more focusing on the management of the peat soils, and then it's up to the farmer. We're kind of leaving that to the farmer to decide what they want to do with the land. But I suppose if this type of approach goes on much longer, it might be something that comes into it. The other side of it, I suppose, as well, like the farms that we're working with in the Midlands and the ones that are adjacent to the raised bogs, it's not like that there's huge, in most cases, it's not that there's huge swathes of land that's being cultivated that is on peat. It's kind of more, a few hectares of the farm is on peat and the rest of the farm isn't. So I don't know, in that situation, it might not be economically viable maybe to sort of have a separate enterprise on your farm, completely separate from the main enterprise on the mineral land.
I think Board Namona and stuff have been looking at the herbs and that kind of stuff, but it's very small scale. And I from what I know, is there's no one's seen any great potential of developing it. From what I know, they've tried cranberries and all these other things, but yeah.
I think they closed this project with Board Namona. It didn't work out. Department of Agriculture is looking at doing livestock on the grassland with shallow water table level. It's not politiculture, but it's something kind of towards this direction, how to produce something on the wetland, on the wet soil. And as Caroline said, this sphagnum farms for horticulture, they kind of experimental research on continental Europe, but it's still on the research stage. I'd say I heard about a few projects, but I didn't hear anything about big scale of politiculture.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually not something that I have ever come across before, so I'll have to do a bit of reading into that. Yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up. There are no more questions, so I just want to say thank you to our fantastic contributors and the presentations this evening. And I think like even the questions session was equally as fun and interesting. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of those of you who showed up this evening and took the time. And I hope you got a lot out of it as well. So have a really nice Tuesday evening. Off having a cup of tea and getting into bed. So I'll talk to you soon, and hopefully see you next week for our very last webinar of the series. So goodbye, everyone.
See ya. Thanks, Aoife.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Aoife.
Bye.
Thanks, Aoife.
Thank you all.
Bye, Elena. Bye, Caroline. Bye, everyone.